Hey, here we are. We can talk a little bit about bump mapping and displacement mapping using two different materials here. One is just your standard Lambert material. So when I select this object here, you can see that it has an Lambert, which is this. It's just the default. It's applied here, and when you click on the material, you can choose colors, transparency, and so on. You can also choose something called bump mapping. Now, what a bump map is basically how the renderer will treat light and dark areas on an image. So to kind of demonstrate that, let's open this up. We'll go to bump map and click right here. And I'm going to choose one that's already here. A good one for bump mapping is using noise. And so when you use noise, it's a black and white image. You can see how it appears here. You can see how it appears as it's applied to the object as well. Now there's different settings for a bump map. In this case, it shows noise type as billow. So you have these kind of bubbly type images here. We can change that later. So you can see as I brighten the image with the threshold, the sample gets lighter and the object here gets, I don't know, how do you explain it? Flatter, I guess, in a way, where the light areas, more light equals a higher raised area. If I bring in more dark areas by sliding the threshold to the left, you can see more dark areas appear here, and there's more depth and kind of an illusion of a surface on the pond right here. So there's different ways that you can adjust this, and the amplitude is how much, I'm really changing the light and dark, but there it is. Different types of texture you can apply, amplitude, ratio, how much you want applied, frequency ratio. You want it really tight, grainy type of a texture that works. And the way this is wrapping around this object, I haven't applied or I haven't UV mapped anything. So everything's just kind of wrapping around it in its own way. And so as I'm changing the frequency, you can see how it rotates around the object. Depth, how you affect the depth of those objects a little bit shallower as you move this way, deeper this way. It also changes the contrast. So really bright areas are going to be shallower. Dark areas are going to look really deeper. And so you can adjust it that way. Time, adjust as this. And a lot of these things can be keyed as well for animation. So you can actually key these motions and movements as on the surface, as a surface material in Maya. Frequency again, implode, how it kind of expands from the center of that image. You can look in the sample how it kind of stretches. I'll set that back to 0. Implode center, much the same. You can set the ratio as how it expands. Billow is where we're at right now. You can choose Perlin noise, and it changes the texture up a little bit. Wave, obviously, it's good if you're doing like a surface material that's simulating kind of a wave pattern. So wispy and space-time. Perlin noise is typically what I use the most, and is very common because you can really adjust it to get all sorts of different types of textures. I like this right here. Kind of gives a good concrete, not super smooth, but kind of rough as well. And so that's bump mapping. And if I were to show this, you can see how it applies that material. Now it's still smooth object. There's nothing different applied to the edges. It's just given kind of a fake or simulated rendering of a texture with some depth to it. Now, the next object, I'm going to apply first a plane because this is look at that plane right there with the material already on it, which is fine. Leave it as that. And I'm going to throw in a quick little light, dome light, because this next one is an Arnold material. And you can do bump mapping with Arnold materials as well. You can also, in bump mapping with an Arnold material is different from Lambert or a Maya software material in that bump mapping you can find down here in geometry, and you can apply a bump map the same way, just through this node right here instead. With this material, what I want to show is displacement mapping. And so if I were to take this object and hit this next node symbol right here, my output, I want to output a material that's called a displacement. And this actually does have an effect on the outside texture and the physical texture of an object. So I went in and applied the same noise as before, and it brings this up. Scale, and we'll come back to this in a minute, but scale is something that we may end up having to adjust later. So I'm going to hit this right here twice to go to my input settings, and I want to, well, let's see what it looks like first. And I'll render this. Oops. Let me change it to Arnold and try again. Sorry about the noise. So I applied the displacement map, and this is what shows up, a giant block. Not good, all right? So we have to do some adjustments here. And so what I'm going to do, it has a repeat UV. And because what it's doing is applying the whole image to the whole object, it might not wrap around because it's reading it as a physical thing, a block of material in a way. It's a 3D texture. So what I'll do here is put something like 10 for each repeating UV for the U and the V settings and see what that does. Okay, it's kind of changed it some. Now I think what I want to do is scale it down. So I'm going to go back to my output node here and then to this place 2D texture. And, oh, sorry, wrong way. I'm going to go back 2 on my output nodes. And I'm going to change my scale instead of 1. Let's see what it does at half of that at 0.5. Enter. So we scaled it down. It's taken shape a little bit better now. Okay. I'm not going to let this completely render out. Let's bring the scale down even more, 0.1. And depending on the object, depending on the texture, this can change, these settings can change as needed. So now you can see there is depth added to both the material on the surface, plus it actually physically changes the shape and the way this object looks. This looks like a really rough pawn piece right here. Now, if I didn't want that refined, I can bring that scale down even more. It's at 0.1. So what if I said 0.075? That makes more sense. 0.075, and then try this again. And that's looking pretty good. So displacement mapping, physically changing the exterior of the object with an Arnold AI surface material. So when I selected this object here and created a material to initially begin, I started with an AI surface. So that's the difference here. So once you get into that, then you can go back and I said, all right, displacement noise, and I applied it. And then I went further into that shader and applied even more. So you can go into the noise and change the noise outputs as well. So you have outputs and inputs. Here's the input, the arrow going into the box, output, the arrow going out of the box. I want to change the output of that, so I can change it right here. The noise itself, just like before, you can change the textures, you can change the threshold, you can change how the material reacts on the surface in a 2D way. So the noise is very 2D type of a texture. Now the problem is, as I'm changing them, you don't really see the changes here with an Arnold unless you have a really nice computer that can process all those changes. I always have to make some changes and then check it back onto the rendering here to see how it all comes out. So that's a quick thing on bump mapping and displacement mapping. So there we go. There's different materials giving them different surfaces and how they react to noise and different mapping properties. And that's all. So we'll see you next time.